Okay, so we are going to start off with 9.5. Hopefully, we finish it all in one go. Unlike 9.4, which was in 3 episodes, this should just be one episode. So, civil rights and global groups that are calling for reform and the responses to that after 1900. So, here is the objective. It says explain how social categories, roles, and practices have been maintained and challenged over time. So the first subtopic within that is rights-based discourses and how they challenge old assumptions about race, class, gender, and religion. So your reading assignment that is associated with this topic is about feminism, feminism both in the West and then in the West, quote unquote, right, and then the global South. So definitely pay attention to that. If I were you, I would make a chart in my notes in which I kind of compared and contrasted the different ways that feminism arose and was practiced in different parts of the global South. That's how I would handle that. So we're going to talk about some kind of different rights-based discourses, like civil rights movement. Particularly, this takes place in the U.S. During the 1960s. Right, you've probably heard of the quote unquote civil rights movement, spearheaded by men like Malcolm X. Wow, that's a rude pug. Um, Men like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., who are working to get the Civil Rights Act passed. Right, and that's in 1964. That's going to end racial segregation, Jim Crow laws, right? They're also going to get the Voting Rights Act. Which is 1965, which does away with poll taxes and other kinds of discriminatory voter suppression acts. But there are also other types of rights-based discourses that are occurring in this time. We have, sad. So we have Hispanic American, or it's called the Chicana movement. There's a really big court case in Texas. I think it's like Hernandez versus Texas. That's about the racial segregation that was taking place for people of Mexican American descent in the Southwest, in places like Texas and Arizona, and etc. That's very interesting. We also have Native Americans. We also have Native American rights. You'll have to excuse Gus. He's very rude and obnoxious. As well as LGBT rights. There's, for example, it's called like the Stonewall movement. And you'll learn about that next year in EPUS history. The focus, right, of your text is women's liberation. Led by French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir. She writes a book called The Second Sex, and in it she talks about how essentially women have been othered, right? So like we kind of create in-groups and out-groups, and the out-group is made to feel that otherness, that women are the out-group, that everything has kind of been defined as though it were for a man, and then exceptions have to be made for women. So women are kind of like always these outsiders looking in. And then an American is Betty Friedan. Another one is going to be Gloria Steinem. Gloria Steinem is still very active today. But Betty Friedan, she writes a book called The Feminine Mystique. In fact, there's this quote. Let me go get it real quick. That I wasn't going to share with you, but now I just feel inspired. She says, this is a quote from her book, The Feminine Mystique, which came out in 1963. She says, "The problem lay buried, unspoken, for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Each suburban wife struggled with it alone as she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children. chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night. She was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is this all? Um, and so that kind of shows this idea that women are defined more than just motherhood, right? By more than just wifehood. That there's more to women and women's fulfillment than that. Um, this is not accepted by everyone. In fact, there are many kind of anti-feminist movements that come out in the 1960s and before and after. And the kind of primary American leader of this anti-feminism, I don't, I think she would argue that she was a feminist in a different way. But her name is Phyllis Schlafly. And she kind of spearheads this traditional women's movement in a sense of um, women should be free to choose the life that they want. And if the life that they want is motherhood and wifehood and homemakerhood, then that is not to be discounted. She leads the fight against the Equal Rights Amendment and is part of the driving force behind the Equal Rights Amendment not being passed. In fact, there's going to be a new, I think, a Netflix series about her. So P. Schlaf, um, she is kind of this leading anti-American feminist person. Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about is access to education, politics, and professions becoming more inclusive. Obviously, you could talk about women getting the right to vote all over the world, and how that happens. Increase access to education, like Miss St. Clair, who you might have next year for English 10 honors. She went to the University of Mary Washington, which is the University of Virginia's school that was created specifically for women. Now it is co-ed, just like the University of Virginia. But a lot of these very elite schools had kind of sister schools that were literally sister schools because they were for the women. In the 50s and 60s, these start to go away, and we start to get a lot more co-ed schools. But the example that we're going to talk about in terms of access to education and professions and politics is the end of apartheid in South Africa. So, apartheid is the Afrikaans word for apartness. Afrikaans is the Dutch language derivative that develops in South Africa while they're colonized by the Dutch before they're colonized by the British, right? And then they become part of the British Commonwealth, part of a dominion, right, for the British. And so they have their own kind of separate independent government, but they still have allegiance to the monarch of Britain. And apartness, this apartheid, is the term that's used to describe, like, we have Jim Crow laws. Well, they have apartheid. And apartheid, while there were always kind of these racial segregation laws in South Africa and systems, like, for example, they put, by they, I mean the white settlers, created Bantu stands. There were like reservations. Like, you know how in the United States they put the Native Americans on reservations and we're like, this is where you can live and you can't get jobs outside of this and you just do you here on this land. That's what they do, but for the Africans. Yeah. So anyway, the system comes to an end in the early 1990s, but it begins like the harshest phase of itself in 1948. So after World War II and during the Cold War, when the Nationalist Party comes into power. So they kind of enshrine the apartheid laws, and they block all legal and nonviolent methods of protest by any non-white. They outlaw the political party, the African National Congress, which is the party to which Nelson Mandela belongs. Many of the leaders of the movement are imprisoned and or go into exile. Nelson Mandela is the most famous of these. In response to this, lots of European countries and other North American countries, they boycott South African goods and companies. The United Nations puts very harsh economic sanctions on them and cultural sanctions on them. Like, for example, they're a few Olympics that they're not allowed to attend because of the apartheid system and because they jail political prisoners like Nelson Mandela. The United States does not outwardly condemn the apartheid government in South Africa, even because I guess it would be kind of hypocritical of us before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but even after that, we don't, and you could probably guess why. The same reason why the United States does other questionable things, it's the Cold War. Um, because South Africa is this kind of quote unquote bulwark against communism in Africa, um, the South African government kind of uses that as a leverage chip to keep the support of the United States. As the Cold War, though, winds down at the end of the 1980s, this defense falls apart, right? Neither South Africa, its government, nor the United States can continue to make the excuse about fighting communism as a way to prop up the apartheid system. Um, there's a bunch of internal unrest, protests in the street. It's a very dangerous place. Like at a certain point, it'll have one of the highest murder rates in the world. And all of this kind of culminates in 1989 when the prime minister at the time, oh no, I don't want you yet, Botha, he steps down in 1989 and a new prime minister comes into power. His name is de Klerk. And one of the first things he does in 1990 is he says that he will um, open up the country for kind of full democracy. So he'll dismantle the apartheid system and he will release political prisoners like Nelson Mandela. So, kind of as soon as that happens, um, the system completely falls apart. De Klerk essentially hands over power to Nelson Mandela, who becomes the first African president of South Africa, the first non-white president of an independent, or non-white president of an independent South Africa. So it's kind of considered one of the last quote unquote decolonizations because that kind of minority control over a majority native population ends with this. Right, and here's Nelson and Winnie Mandela. Okay, and the last thing we're going to talk about is movements throughout the world protesting the inequality of environmental and economic consequences of globalization. We're going to talk more about this. I'm not sure why this is here in this section, but we're going to talk more about it when we get to resistance to globalization. But I did want to talk about one of the environmental movements that arises to kind of as a like call for reform, and it is the Green Belt movement in Kenya. In Kenya, I'll write that. And it's founded by this woman, Professor Wangari Maathai. And what she does, she founds it in 1977. And she's trying to respond to the needs of rural Kenyan women. When she goes to kind of do her research in Kenya, she realizes that a lot of these rural women that they're complaining that their streams are drying up, that their food supply is very insecure, that they have to walk farther and farther in order to get firewood, in order to get water, in order to get food, um, because the land is becoming very degraded. And so she founds this movement, the Green Belt movement. And as she kind of continues to pursue this, she realizes that behind the everyday hardships of these rural women, that there are bigger issues, that the bigger issues are things like that they are very disempowered, that they are disenfranchised, right? That they don't have any actual agency to make political changes, and that the political system in places like Kenya and in other third world countries is kind of geared to enrich the elites and to downplay the needs of the kind of rural people of the countryside who have been kind of downplayed in the colonial system, and now they're continuing to be downplayed now in decolonized quote unquote third world countries. Um, and she, for the Green Belt movement, this isn't kind of general for all of these types of movements, what she kind of chalks a lot of this up to is that the loss of traditional Kenyan values in terms of living in harmony with your environment, that this is really part of the reason that this disenfranchisement and this disempowerment has occurred. In 2004, Professor Matai will win the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts at the Green Belt movement. And one of the main ways that they seek to improve the global environment is through planting trees. That kind of this community act of planting trees. So think about our equivalent is Arbor Day, or Earth Day, right? That this idea of a community coming together to help the communal environment, right? The commons itself.